Could you just sum it up for those who haven't had the advantage of reading your op-ed quite yet?
Okay, very exciting news. Now, most of us know about the oil and gas discoveries off the southern coast of the Cape at Mossel Bay. Those were made a few years ago and are in the process of being assessed. But more recently, within the last year, they've hit oil several times in territorial waters in Namibia's economic zone, just north of South Africa's economic zone, in a geographical feature which stretches right from there down past Cape Town along the coast. So where they've found very good oil in Namibian waters, such that they're calling it one of the 2 hottest offshore drilling destinations in the world at the moment, there's a very, very good prospect that the same type of finds will be made in South African waters.
So it does appear as though it's not just the Southern Cape, but in fact the west coast of South Africa that could be producing a bonanza.
Very much so, and in greater quantities than they have thus far found in the Mossel Bay find, what they call the Padafisi Fairway. I'm not sure who comes up with the names. We've heard of Brulpada and Lepert, which sound pretty good. Well, the wells in the Namibian waters are called by Shell after famous African diamonds, and Total has come up with the Venus field, which is also sounds quite sort of tempting and promising. Those, at this stage, it's entirely speculative as to what's down there. But given what they've found so far, there is informed speculation that whereas we have maybe up to 1 billion barrels of oil out of the Padafisi off Mossel Bay, there could be 10 times that off the west coast. So that is a very significant piece of news.
Why has it taken so long for the world to discover Southern Africa as an oil province? And I say this because it's not that long ago that we had the discovery of the Total field in northern Mozambique, which is the second biggest gas field in the world. Now you say this year already the Namibians are having some very exciting finds. And South Africa, we haven't seen much action on the west coast for years.
I think, Alec, it's largely because of insufficient legislative certainty. It hasn't been a clear framework in place where oil companies know that the terms and conditions under which that if they do drill and find something, they'll be able to exploit it. Now, this has a long history. In 2013-14, when they were considering an amendment to the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, they tried to shoehorn oil and gas into that, and it was a sight to see because it was clearly not properly researched, and it was a real seat of the pants effort. It was passed by Parliament, but then went on to Jacob Zuma, who for once had good legal advice, and refused to sign the bill. So we've been limping by on old legislation, and the government has made it clear that it wants to update that. Now it is currently doing so, something called the Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Bill, which is currently passing through Parliament. It's quite a tortuous process. And when that is concluded, we hope that it will produce a regulatory regime which makes it acceptable for the big oil majors to spend money on drilling here and producing energy.
Hope is not a strategy, as I'm often reminded in a South African context. Why are you feeling that this could change things?
Because the feedback that I'm getting from people in the oil and gas business is that it's doable, that the legislation looks like it's not quite there yet, but it's certainly the best effort so far. And if you look at the kind of money that they're spending on exploration, Total, for example, has spent a good few billion on its Mossel Bay developments. They have to be quite serious about it to spend that kind of money. Just as an indication, if you want to drill one deep sea offshore oil well, it's going to cost you in the order of about 500 million rand. Now, often these things come up dry. So it's a big money game. And they have to have at least a reasonable idea that in the future they'll be able to get some of that back.
So the geology in Namibia and then presumably, as you've explained, going further south and off the west coast of South Africa, is highly prospective. The finds that Total and Shell have had in Namibia would suggest that they'd be quite keen to try a little bit further south.
Absolutely right. And they do have exploration rights in South African waters. It's all part of the same geological feature, and that is the Orange Basin. The offshore part of the Orange Basin, as I said, right from southern Namibia right down to south of Cape Town. So there is a potentially huge area there which could contain oil and gas.
Can you give us some history of how this thing was created, the Orange Basin? I know I'm pushing your geological insights now, but
I'm a politician, not a geologist.
So far? Okay, but it's there. The important thing is that it is there, and it should have gas and oil in the same way as a little further north it does.
Absolutely right. They say that it's exactly the same feature. It has all the same characteristics, and there is no reason to expect that what they're finding just north of the territorial line would not continue into South African waters. And incidentally, I mean, just to give you an idea of where this is, because sea boundaries don't go directly east-west, they go in at the angle that the river or the angle at which the boundary reaches the coast. So the Orange River takes a big turn to the south and the border with Namibia. So it heads off to the southwest. So if you were to go directly to the nearest shore from both the Total and Shell finds in Namibia, you would probably hit about Port Nolloth. And of course, think of it from the country's perspective. We want as much development as possible so we can take as much revenue as possible as government revenue. And then there are also the secondary effects of some employment and so on. When you've got a big oil field offshore, there's a lot of shore-based logistics, which are going to create a lot of jobs and a lot of value for South Africans. So whereas they may not all be working on oil rigs, they may be working boats that are transporting supplies to those oil rigs. They may be working on choppers. They may be working on pipelines. Because, of course, that's the other thing. What do you do when the stuff comes out of the ground? Well, these offshore fields, it seems that they would put the oil directly onto oil tankers and ship it off to the appropriate oil refineries around the world. Now, remember, some oil is heavier than others, are, again, highly technical. But then what you've also got is a lot of gas. And it's difficult to transport gas from out in the ocean. So it's very likely that gas will be piped to shore. Now, once you've got it on the shore, you've got a couple of options. One is to turn it into liquefied petroleum gas, put it on tankers and go and sell it on markets around the world. That's very profitable if you've got the right quantities, which it seems they have. And the other option is to have gas that you can use onshore. And you could use it probably most efficiently to generate power. And of course, that's something that South Africans would be very interested in at the moment.
This is an interesting and very uplifting story, but for citizens, how long will it take for the tortuous process of legislation to reach its course?
This law should go through before the end of this parliament. In other words, before about May next year. All being well. It's then expected by the oil companies that they will be drilling and hopefully, but they're quite confident about it, discovering in South Africa in about 2 years from now. And remember, we're not just doing this for them. We'll be getting probably in excess of 60% of the value of every barrel of oil will come into government coffers through a variety of taxes, royalties, etc., because that's more or less the international standard around the world. And that's a lot of money for us.
Explain that, James. Explain that 60% of say $100, just to use a round figure, $100 a barrel of oil, 60% of that goes to the country where the oil is situated.
That's right. There's, as I say, a whole variety of taxes and royalties come into that. Namibia takes, for example, 10% for its national oil company. We would do the same. In South Africa, they're also wanting a 10% set aside for black business. That would come out of that 60%, presumably. So I suppose that's a bit of a reduction under the current government, under what the country would be taking. But yeah, that's apparently standard, and so that means a lot of money for us. The head of South Africa's petroleum agency reckons that if the Brillpotter and Leipert discoveries are exploited, the ones off Mossel Bay, it would add about 9 billion rand a year to South Africa's economy.
It's a couple of percentage points less in VAT for starters. And if you were then to look to the West and the numbers that you've been talking about, 10 times that, we could have a Norwegian type situation. Richest country in the world today, Norway, because of its oil reserves.
That was what was said to me by one of the people involved in the projects, that they expect in 10 years, Namibia's government receipts will be around the same as the government receipts that the Norwegian government gets from its oil and gas endowment. So that's a lot of money.
Sounds a little bit like what happened in, again, referring to your op-ed in 1867 with the discovery of diamonds. It transformed South Africa. As we know, tragic circumstances there with wars and all kinds of other tension, as there was a grab for the wealth that came from diamonds. But it certainly did develop the country. Similarly with the discovery of the Witwatersrand gold. Is it in that kind of league from a South African context?
Well, I took a bit of a flyer in my op-ed and said that I thought that it was. And just looking at the types of numbers they're talking about, I think you could make a good case that it is equivalent to one of those great geological features that has pushed along the South African economy and allowed us to change from a rural backwater, which we were in 1866, to potentially a properly developed modern economy.
And if you're getting 60% of every barrel of oil coming into the country, it could do a heck of a lot for education, social services, and in all other kinds of doing good things that governments want to do.
But Alec, it's not just shale gas that we're sitting on. I mean, there's some tremendously exciting developments in Mpumalanga, for example, which I'm currently looking at, so I don't know that much about them yet. But I can tell you that there's a company called Kinetico, which has found extensive gas in the area between Ermelo and Amersfoort, or around Amersfoort. And they have drilled, I think, 27 wells in that area. Now, this is apparently a fairly unique geological feature. They're getting oil out of sandstone and also oil out of coal. Gas out of sandstone and coal. At this stage, they've put down 27 wells, all of which have found significant gas. And they reckon that there's another possibly up to 5 trillion cubic feet of gas in that area. Now that again is incredibly good news. They are at the point of producing. They are looking at possibly powering or making electricity in the local area and pushing it into grids. The great thing about those discoveries, is that they're very close to the whole industrial power infrastructure that South Africa has. That's where it's close to where the coal-fired power stations are in the Mpumalanga Highveld. It's close to transport routes. It's close to, you've got electricity pylons there already. So they're talking about not only gas creating power, but also using LNG as a substitute for diesel to power trucks. Now, this is something you will know that Renogen in the Free State is already started to do. They've got an LNG plant there, and they're producing enough so they reckon they can run thousands of trucks on LNG instead of diesel, which would be a huge saving for the country, and possibly make more of it available for Eskom.